these things. And if I don't have an answer, I can always check and let you know through Jody later on. So just one more thing about me. I'm an academic of the Italian Academy of Cuisine. We Italians take these things very seriously. This is an organization recognized by the Italian Republic, and so it's something on which I'm particularly proud, and I have set up the New Mexico chapter. So that's why I'm delegate for New Mexico. So let's get into Rome. What we'll do, we'll describe the evolution of Roman cuisine, talking about Roman history, because the way how history evolved greatly impacted on how the Roman cuisine evolved. We are talking about 1200 years. Right, the foundation of Rome, according to tradition, is 753 before Christ by Romulus, and the Western Roman Empire formally falls in 476 AD. So it's more or less 1200 years. But we'll see how Roman diet and way of cooking developed during this time. Originally, Romans were very frugal. They had a simple diet, and they would just use the readily available ingredients in their area. Then things developed. Rome first went through fighting the Etruscans. They were northern Rome in the current Tuscany mostly. They conquered Italy. Then they had existential fight with Carthage, and finally they developed in an empire, and the empire had a much greater variety of food and spices. And eventually they started decaying until they collapse in the 5th century. So that's where Rome starts, right? See, that's central Italy, about 500 before Christ. Rome was still a very limited territory. See, it took a while. It took like 300 years to conquer most of Italy. And it took even more to get to the maximum expansion that is in the 2nd century AD. So you can imagine that this greatly influenced what kind of ingredients at least the ruling classes could get in Rome, because the history of cooking in Rome is also clearly a classist story. The poor people, they just would get what they could, and then the rich people, they used food as a status symbol. So the first period that we consider is the kingdom. Rome had traditionally 7 kings, from Romulus to Tarquinius Superbus, and this lasted a couple of hundred years. Tarquinius Superbus, that was actually an Etruscan, was deposed in 509 before Christ. And as I was saying earlier, the diet at this time was very simple: cheese, polenta that was made of farro. You can still find farro nowadays, right? If you go, for instance, Trader Joe's, they have some pretty good variety of farro. The technical name is Triticum dicoccum. It's emmer, similar to spelt. Then they used olive oil, although olive oil started being much more used after Greece was conquered. Honey, they didn't use sugar the way we do today. So in a lot of Roman recipes, you find honey to give the sweetness, and cabbage. They ate a lot of cabbage. Not necessarily that fun if you do it every day. The meat was used very rarely, and beef meat continued not being used for most of Roman history, both for tradition and laws. They limited that because it was important to have cows for the agriculture process. And it was mostly rich families that would have meat. And most people would get their ingredients from their own small parcel of land. So they would get what they would find on their land. Things changed dramatically in the next period. Pretty wide, we're seeing about 300 years, where Rome went from having conquered most of Italy to the Punic Wars. So the Punic Wars are the wars with Carthage. This was probably the most difficult time in Rome history. Probably many of you have read or heard about Hannibal. animal-grade Carthage general. He was the one that was able to take the war to Rome, defeated the Romans in several wars, but finally had to retreat back to Carthage. And he was defeated in the Battle of Zama in 202. So what happened during these wars, once Rome overcame this existential threat, and they ended up actually destroying Carthage, in the process, Rome developed from Italy to a true multinational empire. See, if you see this map, we have 264. When the war started, Rome had just this part of Italy. And by the time they finished, they had Spain, Greece, part of what is now the coastal area of the former Yugoslavia, and they controlled directly or indirectly part of Northern Africa. So of all these countries, at this time, the one that had the greatest influence was Greece. Because Romans didn't use much bread until there was the Greek influence. And actually, from the 2nd century before Christ, bakeries were typically run by Greek either immigrants or freed slaves, liberti, they were called. Oil became much more used, and also wine was not used much before and started being used in the Roman diet in the way how the Greek would drink it. So watered down, I think was 2 measures of water for each 3 measures of wine. And with the wealth that came from the development of Rome toward an empire, their ruling class started to change its behavior. So in the ancient Rome, in the Rome of all the first part of the Republic, it was important to keep frugality. The Romans, also the Roman leaders, were proud of their frugality or their attachment to Rome, on their willingness to sacrifice for the glory of Rome. While increasingly there was a search for luxury and a certain amount of what today we would consider hedonism. And within this context, in the late Republic, there started being some attention about cuisine. So you had a number of authors that, one way or the other, started writing about Roman cuisine. And the ones that we know about are Marcus Cato. Cato the Censor is a very important character in Roman history. When you see all the various Cato Institute there, they typically refer either to Cato the Elder, there is Cato the Censor, or Cato the Younger, that died in the wars against Caesar. Varro Reatinus also wrote about, see, a lot of these writings were about agriculture. Within agriculture, they also gave recipes. Julius Columella, and Gaius Matthius is very important, not only because he wrote 3 volumes on cuisine, but also because he developed new plants and trees. In Italy, one of the most prized variety of apples is still the one that he invented and started cultivating in northeastern Italy. And so cuisine was treated more as something as either for its medical relevance or on this social treatise, except for Gaius Matthius, and started incorporating increasingly ingredients from various areas of the empire. By the time Caesar dies, when he's killed in 44 before Christ, this is the extension of the Roman controlled territory. So you can imagine spices coming from the Middle East, all kind of exotic animals coming from Northern Africa, and so on. So things develop even more toward wealth, and we also talk about recipes and what we know about the recipes nowadays during the empire. The empire starts in 14 AD with what initially was called the princeps. So Octavianus Augustus adopted son of Caesar after various a very long civil war, becomes the first, in fact, emperor, although not yet called formally emperor. And what happens from this time on, as I was saying, much more bread and wine. Fish, that was not part of the typical Roman diet, starts being important, particularly for rich families. And there were families that were be willing to pay huge amounts of money to get high quality fish. In my studies about Apicius, that, as I will tell you in a few minutes, is the author of the only cookbook that survived the Middle Ages from this period. Apicius is said to have been willing to pay even the equivalent of over 10,000 euros, sorry, $12,000 of today's money for a particularly big fish, like a 6-pound fish. We're talking about pretty high price by the pound. Spices and exotic fruits and meats came in from the rest of the empire. You find in a lot of recipes the plums from Damascus being, for instance, very highly priced. And this, as I said, while the lower class kept a simpler diet. In Rome, they used the expression panem et circenses, that means bread and circus shows, because in order to keep the population in the capital calm, the tradition became to give them the right to free bread and an increasing number of games in the Colosseum. Pretty bloody games, but the Romans liked very much, so that they became mostly their standard. So what happens in this period? The cuisine becomes complex and also pretentious. Basically, Roman upper class, they needed to show also through the banquets how powerful and wealthy they were. It became kind of a big show. And these overcame, of course, the original frugality. The Roman society was very competitive. Romans always strived to get higher in the social ladder. And so that demonstrated that you had more wealth than someone else, you were more important than someone else if you could have these banquets spending what would be tens of thousands of current dollars each time. Another thing that happened, another reason why the wealthiest part of society starting getting so much involved with food is that they had lost real power. The Senate kept existing for a long time, but by now Rome had become an absolute absolute autocracy, with the emperor having all powers, and it went increasingly that way. So the Roman upper class became more interested in these apparently less important pleasures, because they couldn't really have the power that they used to have, that they use to exercise. This created some pushback. There were pushback, first of all, about morality, which is interesting because Roman society, compared to our current moral code, had quite lax sexual habits. But that was not a concern. A certain amount of promiscuity and outright abuses was pretty much accepted, but the excess on food were seen by many moralists as something hardly acceptable. And the health started deteriorating, because think about having these huge banquets almost every night, with drinking and eating huge amounts until dawn, with puking continuously and so on. If that's done, particularly when you start not being in your 20s anymore, if at my age, I'm 50, I would do that every other night, I think my health would go downhill very fast. There are even historians that think that part of the decadence and the collapse of the Roman Empire is due to the declining health of its ruling class. They went from its early days when they had a very healthy military and fields life to this kind of lifestyle. So let's see how meals were organized in ancient Rome. Uh, Romans would have 3 meals. They were spread out between early morning and 3 p.m. The breakfast called ientaculum was very often was neglected. It was more important for soldiers because they need energy. But many Romans would just get a glass of water or just some bread and cheese. Consider that both for breakfast and lunch, that was called Prandium, Romans would not sit down, they would just eat standing. For lunch, you could have maybe some cold meat, often left over from the day before, vegetables, fruit, a little bit of wine, things like that. So both ientaculum and prandium were not particularly important. The most important meal was the cena, dinner. And that, as I was telling you, could last very long. And what is interesting on the cena is that was eaten on, I don't know if you've seen some pictures or paintings about ancient Rome or in some films. The Romans would not sit. They would lay on what is called the triclinia. Those were special beds. They were structured in a way in which 3 persons could sit comfortably, typically laying on their side, and they would eat like that. Sitting was very uncomfortable. And to give you an idea, when Cato the Younger was fighting Caesar and then Augustus, he said that as a form of protest against the tyranny, he would always eat sitting until tyranny would be defeated. So saying clearly was a sacrifice, right? When if you read it with today's eyes, you say, yeah, okay, so what? You know, you're sitting, good for you. So that's a very interesting episode that makes you understand what was the idea at the time. And when you had the banquet, some of the guests was appointed to supervise the good organization of the cena, and this person was called the triclinarca. So it was something taken very seriously. As far as the etiquette, there would be plates at the center, and the guests would serve themselves. They wouldn't use forks. They would just bring from home a spoon if there was, for instance, a soup. Very large use of wine. And again, things that are considered weird today, flatulence and burping was normal, was well accepted, and there are even imperial decrees saying, encouraging people to emit these sounds because it was good to help them getting things out. A certain amount of sexual licentiousness, as I mentioned. Now, going into the recipes, we don't know very much about the Republican time because there is only one recipe book that survived from the imperial time. It's called De Re Coquinaria from Apicius. Apicius was a gourmand that lived in the 1st century AD in Minturno, southern Italy, between Rome and Naples, basically. He spent huge fortunes on these banquets until in 37 AD he realized that he had spent too much and he couldn't go on with this kind of life anymore. And he did the thing that the Romans would do if they decided their life was not dignified anymore. He made suicide. Although important Roman philosophers like Seneca criticizes him because he thinks that was a very stupid reason to make suicide. I mean, not being able to eat like a pig for the rest of your life, it's to many philosophers is not a reason to end your life. Though what is important about Apicius, for as silly as his life choices might seem, is that this is a book that gives us a very clear idea of what the Roman upper class would eat. What we have is a book that developed along the centuries. Most historians think that the versions that we have now solidified in the 4th century, so with addition from later periods. I'm not going to tell you all the reasons why they came to that conclusion. What is interesting to see in these recipes is a very particular cooking philosophy, very different from the current one. First of all, contrasting tastes, a lot of bittersweet. So you would get vinegar, honey, wine, all together on meat, soup, and other things. Spices were used very abundantly, and that's something that remained in the whole of European cooking until really until the 18th, 19th century. Bitter sauces were used, and there was this idea, a lot for spectacularization that I told you, to hide the ingredients. So there was the attempt to make it difficult for people eating to recognize what was in there. It was considered very classy, refined to have this kind of results. In the recipes, the typical ingredient that you find the most of the time is garum. See, I gave you a picture because this kind of sauce still exists. Today it's called colatura di cetara, and that's the bottle that I buy for my own cooking. It's pretty expensive, but it's basically a fish sauce that derives from the fermentation, or you could say rottening, of anchovies and other small fishes in the sun, and the liquid that comes out of that makes this sauce. Some people find it gross, like I cannot use this at home because my wife and daughter hate the idea, but it's actually very tasty and brings a lot of balance to the recipes. So yeah, they really loved it, and here allow me to do a little bit of self-advertisement. As I was saying, I teach at UNN continuing education classes on contemporary and Roman Italian cuisine. They're via Zoom. I teach from my kitchen, so let me know if you're interested, or go on the catalog of continuing education for that. But let me give you some example of recipes from this time. We have Persian lamb that was cooked using prunes, onions, herbs, pepper, wine, oil, garum. Or fried eggs with pine nuts, celery, honey, vinegar, and garum. See, you see that garum all the time, the fish sauce, right? You might be surprised to find fish sauce on lamb or on pork, but they did it. And I have to tell you, I listed here recipes that I actually cook myself. And as much as they can look weird initially, what is fascinating about these recipes is how all these apparently contrasting and incompatible tastes blend together. The pork shoulder stew from Matthias, remember I mentioned Matthias as one of the other authors of recipe books that was famous at the time. This I cooked it yesterday and is very delicious, mostly probably better in winter than when it's hot, but I wanted to practice it a little bit. You have pepper, oil, broth, coriander, apples, mint, honey, vinegar, wine, sausages, leeks, and garum. It seems like you just get random ingredients and throw them in there, but actually the result is very, very balanced. So interesting cooking, sometimes disgusting. So the Apicius book is 100 recipes, and honestly, a good half of them, I wouldn't want to try them. But you can find a good 10 or 20 that are actually very good even nowadays. So what happens after that? Let me just tell you in the centuries to come to give you an idea of what we still have today from this period. In the Middle Ages, cooking followed the same fate of many other arts. It mostly disappeared. It was reduced to mere subsistence. Rome, from being the capital of the empire, became semi-abandoned. There weren't even communication in the peninsula, so there was it was a very hard life, and there wasn't any focus at all on cooking. Most of the recipes and techniques from the Roman period were lost, although in limited reach and culture circles, they still survived. And that's how the Apicius book came to us. Things changed a little in the Renaissance. By the end of the 15th century, the society was again vibrant. There was more trade. Food started circulating again, and Rome became very important. Rome was the center of power and wealth in Italy, therefore became also the center of the Italian culinary arts. I say, be careful to the Borgias, I say, right? They're known for poisoning their enemies. But chefs and food came to Rome from all over Italy. And although the first important cookbook of the modern ages actually comes from Maestro Martino da Como, that you see mentioned here. He was from the north. He mostly worked with Milan, but in Milan I ended up being able to keep developing his skills under the protection of a bishop. So still the Papal Rome was still fundamental in the renaissance of food at this time. But his book is very interesting because it's the first one that is a cookbook in the modern sense with the recipes, quantities, techniques very well described. And then we come to the modern time. Modern Italian cooking is very different. We don't have the sweet bitter contrast. There is not the idea of covering the taste of ingredients. Actually, we have very defined limited amounts of ingredients in most Italian dishes, and the kind of sauces that I use are very different from the Roman ones because they come from the French Nouvelle Cuisine developed from the 18th century as part of the French imperial ambitions. And beginning from Taillevent was the first great author of food writings in France. However, we still have some recipes that came all the way from the Roman time. In Rome, a typical dish is the Paleata. It's something that you cook with the pasta and basically using the intestines of the calf. I will not give you all the details because they can be found a little bit gross, but it's something that was done at the Roman time and just was not lost in history. And every region in Italy have some food of this kind. Now, this would be the end, but before asking you for question, because this is something that we're doing with the library, I want to give you an idea of basic bibliography that I used. Marcus Apicius, the Recoquinaria that I mentioned to you. The original, of course, is in Latin, but there are many good translations in English. I use the Italian one, but if it's something that you are curious, you can easily find it in Amazon. Seneca I mentioned only because in his Consolatio ad Elviam to his mother, he criticizes Apicius. So it's just as a source of where the criticism comes from. A wonderful book is from John Dickey in English. It's called Delizia. And he's an Oxford professor, and he wrote about the history of Italian cooking in a very informed but also funny and ironic way. I really loved him. Bartolomeo Scappi is the most important chef of the Renaissance. He used to cook for popes. And he wrote the first encyclopedia of cooking in the 16th century. I cannot find an English version, so there was nothing I could advise you there. A very good book about the history of cooking and of ingredients and so on is this French book, La Cuisine et la Table, by Jacques Le Goff and Jean Ferniaud. The original is in French. I found an Italian translation, but you probably can find it in English as well. And Maestro Martino da Como, as I told you, he wrote the first modern cookbook, and here is the opposite thing that I have for other issues. Strangely enough, I can't find anywhere an Italian version, but there is a very good English translation with very good essays explaining his ideas and the context by the University of California Press. I bought this just last week. Okay, so this is, as you can see, we went very quick, right? My task was in half an hour to tell you all about 2,000 years of Roman cuisine. So of course it was pretty fast, but I hope that you got a general idea out of this. Do you have any questions?
We do have a couple minutes left, so if anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask.
And by the way, yeah, sorry, go on.
I have a question. I've
Sure.
seen the bread stamped. Do you know if the bread was stamped before cooking or after cooking? The bread that they found in Pompeii?
Stout? Well, I don't know the English word. What does it mean? Sorry.
Like an imprint, a stamp that you stamp, like Play-Doh. Okay.
Okay, sorry. You know, I don't know. That is a good question, and actually would be useful for me also to develop in my classes at UNM. When was it? I would be able. I can. Jody, I can write to you about this once I find out.
Okay, and
Because
then
I would like to give a feedback to Becca.
Great. So let me know, and then if you want to email me, my email is jmiller@rrnm.gov, and I can pass that information on to you.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Perfect. And if any of you are interested about understanding how to cook any of these dishes, I can send you some tips. You don't have to take my classes. I'm not trying to just doing marketing for the paid classes. I just love talking about these things. Okay.
Well, we loved hearing about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Becca.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Well, we're down to the last minute, so I will say thank you all for attending. We appreciate having you, and thank you for doing the presentation for us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jody. This was fun. I always enjoy it.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
However, thank you. Thanks to you. Thanks to you. And I have to tell you, thanks. I'm gonna eat tonight, actually, the leftover stew that I was telling you about. So it's I got into the atmosphere yesterday. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Professor.
Bye.